accessibility. And I did a workshop previous to this where I went over the first 5 ways that you can improve student access. And this is going a little bit deeper into an additional 5 ways. So in my last workshop, we talked about all of the different categories of students that might have difficulty with accessing things in our course. So it goes beyond those students with identified disabilities to also include the students that have possible unidentified challenges due to either disabilities that are identified or ones that are not. Sometimes some temporary challenges as well. But then there's also that third category of students that have external circumstances that are getting in the way of them being able to access all of our content. So this could be technology issues, like we've experienced some of our students don't have the best Wi-Fi. It could be that the environment in which they're living is not very conducive to accessing everything from our course, or maybe they have difficulty listening to our recorded PowerPoints because of the noise level that they're in at the moment. So the purpose of us improving accessibility in our course are not just for the students with identified disabilities, but it's for all students. So we want all students to be able to access everything. And my phrase from my last workshop was digital text and formatting solves all your problems, but not really. And we went over alternate text so that images are accessible. We went over links that actually describe the destination and can be understood when they're out of context, so that those with screen readers can understand where a link is headed to. We talked about headings and lists in documents that help to organize, but also help for navigation, especially for those that are using screen readers. We talked about the fact that common PDFs are really just images that are not accessible, but that adding digital tagging can make them more accessible for our students. And that adding captions to our recorded videos can increase the accessibility of that audio information that we're providing, not just for those with hearing impairments, but also those students where English is a second language, or where the environment is not conducive to them hearing the information from a video. And then we also talked a little bit about some of the accessibility checks that are in some of the programs. So for today, my phrase is promote perception and predictable paths. So the takeaways that I want you to get from today are that perception is not the same for everyone. And it doesn't have to be an identified disability or something that you can see where someone might not be seeing, hearing, or understanding the information in the same way. And that consistent navigation is good for all of us. But it especially helps those that have some organizing difficulties. So my objectives today are that you will be able to share with others the importance of accessibility in our courses. You'll be able to identify 5 additional strategies that can improve the accessibility in your course. You'll be able to follow the steps to make accessibility changes, and that you can choose one foundational strategy that you can start implementing now. And I talked before too that I don't expect you to be able to jump on board and do all of these strategies. That would be extremely overwhelming. But if you choose one to start with and you build that into your course, then it's easier to add on an additional one every so often until you have things more accessible. So the first strategy for today is identification, order, and navigation. So this is it actually comes from the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And what it is saying is that elements that have the same function across multiple pages, so this could be within our Canvas course, they should all use the same way of identification, so the same icons or the same labels. They should appear in the same order, and they should be able to be accessed in the same way. And I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. But it increases navigation speed and accuracy, both for those that are using assistive technology, but also just for the general population as well. If students know exactly where to look and exactly what something is called, once they learn it on week 1, they'll know it for the rest of the course. It increases the student's ability to focus on the content instead of searching for where something's located. And it aids in those that have some difficulty with planning or problem solving. So if something is always called the same thing, it always looks the same way, and it's always in the same place, it's much easier for those students. So one of the easiest ways is to use templates. And I absolutely love templates. I think they are the way to go. So with a template, you can have consistent identification. So you can easily have the same words on a page for each module if you're using modules. You can use the same icons to identify those words. So I always have a little book icon that identifies the readings. So anywhere that there's readings on any of the pages, they're identified with the word readings and with the icon of the book. And then navigation, if you're using modules and you have pages, they should come in the same order, and students should not have to try to figure out how to navigate between those pages. So I use 2 different ways of navigation in my modules. Students can either use the previous and the next buttons, or I also include that module item list at the bottom of each page, so that they can see at a glance what the items are within that module and go between them. The next strategy for increasing accessibility is color and contrast. And many people hear that and they automatically think, oh, this is for people who have color blindness. And that's a big misconception. There are many people that have low vision, which is just a term that describes other visual impairments, that also have difficulty with colors and especially with contrast. And contrast is not just contrast between colors, it's actually the contrast between luminosity or brightness. So it's best practice to not use color as a meaning in your content or as a way to distinguish between choices, okay? Because there are some people who really don't see color at all. And if you're looking for the minimum for contrast, it's 4.5 to 1 for the contrast between luminosity of 2 items on a page. And I will show you examples of these as well. So in addition to those with low vision or color blindness, another thing is if you start out with a high contrast, and not using color as a meaning, it allows for customization. So there are going to be students that want to adjust the color for other reasons. So you may have a student that has some neurological impairment that actually needs to have a black background with white lettering. You might have a student that actually sees better if the background instead of white is yellow. And there are ways that students can do this. But when they make those customizations and they adjust your documents or your pages, then it changes what the colors look like to them. So if you're using color as a meaning, it's no longer going to have the same meaning. And if you start out with high contrast, it's always easier to go down to a lower contrast if a student needs that, but it's very difficult to go back up to a high contrast. Okay, let's look at some examples. So this is an example of a page where color is used extensively. So you see from the top, the highlighted word is highlighted in yellow. In the second sentence, the word link is an actual link to an outside website. Now, number one, the link is not accessible because it doesn't say where it's going. But if that were to be a link, it doesn't have anything besides the color blue that indicates that it's a link. So one of the things that we often do is we have an underline under links that adds an additional indication so that the color isn't the only indication that it is a link. And then we have the lovely pie chart here with its vibrant colors. And down below, it shows the labels for those colors as indicated. But you'll see that there's no labels actually on the pie chart. And that can be a problem if instead of color, you're seeing things in terms of gray. So this is the same page on a gray scale. And depending on how your vision is, you may be able to tell that there is something different about the word highlighted, but it certainly doesn't look highlighted here. The word link in the second sentence is slightly different shade of gray. But again, it's not something that's going to be easily identified as a link for someone who doesn't see the color. And then, of course, our pie chart, it may be difficult to discern where the pieces of the pie are, depending on the shade of gray. But we also cannot match up the labels. So those colors had a meaning in that pie chart, and that meaning is completely lost when it's in gray. So to increase our accessibility, when you're doing things like highlighting text, if you attach a comment to that, that would add that digital formatting that we talked about in the last webinar, where that will indicate to people who are using accessible technology tools that there is something special about that text. So a lot of screen readers and things like that do not indicate when something is highlighted. But adding something that has that digital formatting component to it, like a comment, would be able to be picked up. Just go ahead and underline all links. Get in the habit of that. Most of the time when you create a link, it automatically underlines it for you, but there are some times where a link just is colored blue and doesn't have the underline. So get in the habit of just adding that underline so that it is accessible to everyone. And then use identifying labels on sections of a graph or chart so that the label is right next to it. And that color is not used to discern sections of a graph or to be able to identify its label. So there are a lot of contrast checkers out there. This is one that I especially like because it will also look at your links. And this goes to show you why underlining links is so important. This allows you to go in and choose the color for your background color, the color that the body text is, but then also your link color. And so the page here on the right is actually the last page in this slideshow, and I ran it through this contrast checker. And it allows you, when you click on the little color box, it will bring up this choose a color dialog box. And if you pick the little, it looks like a little dropper, you can select the exact color from your screen, and it will use that to do the comparison. So I selected the background color, the text color, and the link color from here. And as you can see, I passed 2 of the categories, but I failed the link to body text. So what this means is my link color to the background, so this blue color of the links against the background, passed. So it has appropriate contrast for the web contrast accessibility guidelines of AA, which there are different categories in that. But that passed. The body text to the background, which would be this black text against the background, it also passed. But what did not pass is the contrast between the link color, the blue, and the body text color, the black. So if these links did not have an underline, it would not have enough contrast between the link and the body text to know or to indicate that that was something special about that was a link. So as you can see, that would only be something that really fails if I didn't have the underline there, because the underline indicates that it is a link visually. So that's why I really reiterate the fact that whenever you have a link, just go ahead and add the underline. It's much easier than trying to find a color that works for link, body, and background. Okay, so the next area is document spacing. So the space between lines of a text should be at least 1.5. There should be an extra space between paragraphs, and the spacing between words in a line of text should be equal. So all of this helps with reading. It also helps those that are trying to navigate different sections of text, being able to see the extra space between the paragraphs. And it also aids with those who have low vision or processing challenges because of the extra space between the lines and the paragraphs, and that there isn't extra space between the words. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute too. So just to go over how to format spacing, in Word, if you go to line spacing options and you choose 1.5 for the lines, and then if you don't click the little box that says don't add a space, so it's like the double negative so that it does add the space between the paragraphs, that will set up the formatting for that page. And then if you want to, you can go down to the bottom and click the set as default. And you can either set it for just this document, or you can set it for all of your documents. So that's something that I've gone ahead to do, just so every time I pull up Word, it automatically sets it up that way. I don't have to think about that, because there's a lot of other accessibility things that you have to think about. So sometimes you choose what's going to be easiest to remember. So then on Google Docs, same thing, you have the line spacing, you can choose 1.5, and then you can either add the space before the paragraph or the space after the paragraph. When you have several paragraphs, it doesn't make much of a difference which one you choose for that. So as far as the justification of the text, the phrase that people use is choose rags over rivers. So the rags would be here on the left, where the ends of the lines are ragged. versus this one is where it is justified on both the left and the right sides. And when a lot of times when text does that, it creates unequal spaces between words. When they line up just right, it does form rivers of white spaces between the words. And that can make it very difficult for some people to read and for their eyes to remain focused on that line of text, jumping over those rivers of white. So that's why we choose rags over rivers. Okay, tables. So with tables, there are actually several different accessibility issues with them. They are definitely not the most accessible way of showing information. So we should really only use tables when we truly have to organize data that should be in a table. And the one thing we should not use tables for is to align text. So a lot of times people end up using a table instead of using columns. And this actually makes it very inaccessible because the reading order for tables is different. So when a screen reader comes to read a table, it's going to read it across instead of everything down. So if you have text that should be in a column, you should be using columns, and I'll show you that in a minute. The other thing about tables is that a screen reader can identify a header row. So that would be where you would typically put the labels for each of the columns. And it can use that header row to signal when it's reading a certain block of data in that table. So it can indicate that it is in the column of whatever that label is. So identifying that header row digitally is very important for the screen reader. So you might go in and you might put your word label there, and you could even, make it bold, but that doesn't actually digitally identify the format for that table for the screen reader. In order to do that, you have to indicate that that is the header row for the screen reader to have that understanding. And I'll show you about that in a minute too. Okay, so just a review of how to make columns for your text. In Word documents, it's under Layout and then Columns. And then in Google Documents, it's under Format and then Columns. In Canvas, if you're using Design Tools is actually able to take a list and make it visually appear as columns, but there's no way to really create columns in the same way that you would in Word or Google. But the Design Tools does have a lot of nice effects if you want something to visually appear, for a list to visually appear as several columns across the screen. And then in order to format a table, so in Word, if you go to Table Design, there's a couple of things that you need to make sure. You need to make sure that this header row that's up here on the top left is clicked. So if there is a checkbox here that the first column is the header row, then a screen reader will read these as the labels for this entire column. So once you put your labels in there, that will indicate that for a screen reader. But another thing that you need to do to make sure that it is fully accessible is to provide alt text for it. So in order to do that, you actually have to go to the table layout And then it is properties, which is the third one down on the left-hand side. And then this table properties dialog box comes up, and alt text is the last option on the right. And you can put in the title of the table and then a long description. So sometimes a table might not be easily understood unless you fully describe what that table is showing. And so that could be then put in that long description box. So if you're creating a table in Canvas, you would go to table and you would click on the row, and then you can bring up row properties. Okay, and under row type, you have choices of header, body, and footer. So you would click the header for the row type for that top row, and then that would indicate that that's the header. And when you put your labels in there, a screen reader would then read it correctly, that identifies that column of data. And currently, there is no way to indicate a header row in a table in Google. So that is a limitation of Google at the moment. Hopefully that will be corrected, but currently no way to indicate a header row in Google. Okay, so once you are using captions with your videos, there are two other things that you need to think about in order to really have accessible audio and visual materials. And those two things are the fact that the user should have full control of that audio. And then also that there are either audio or there are text descriptions of any type of actions or movements or important visual information on that screen that someone would not get from just the speech that's going on. So when a video or an audio track is played automatically, that can be very confusing for some of the users. And it can especially interfere with certain assistive devices, especially the ones that students use that have speech involved with them. So it's often best that your audio or your video does not play automatically. Like you can set it up with your slides in PowerPoint to play automatically. That's usually not best practice. And then those audio and text descriptions, obviously, they give more information for those users who are either blind or that have low vision, that have difficulty discerning what is actually happening on the screen. So like I said, don't use the audio play. The other thing is, when it's possible, provide a link to the video instead of only embedding the video. And the reason why is that there are certain users of accessibility tools that certain media players work better with their tool than other media players. So if you provide a link to the video, that student or user can use their media player of their choice in order to play it back. As far as the audio descriptions of actions happening on the screen, the easiest thing to do is to narrate the actions while you're creating the video. Because anything else, you're going to have to go back and add things to it. So if you can get in the habit of describing what you're doing when you're doing it, you take out the need to add the things afterwards. But if that's not possible, or if you didn't remember to do that, the next best thing is to provide a text description of what the actions were in the video transcript. So that could be accessed by anyone that has access to the transcript. And then the best case scenario, but also the more complicated, is that you provide a secondary audio track of those actions that could be turned on or off depending on the user's preference. So for today, again, my takeaway is to promote perceptions and predictable paths. And what are your questions?